A global CBDC system where all your assets are tokenized on a centralized government blockchain, meaning you own nothing. This is what the future of the financial system looks like, according to a recent report by the Bank for International Settlements, the Bank for Central Banks. Now, this is not the first time that they've published such a scary study, but it comes at a time when central banks and governments are rushing to roll out their central bank digital currencies and so-called fast payment systems. That's why today I'm going to summarize this report and tell you what you can do to protect yourself from the future financial system that governments and central banks seem to be planning. The report I'll be summarizing today is titled, quote, Blueprint for the Future Monetary System, Improving the Old, Enabling the New. It's the third part of a much larger annual economic report published by the Bank for International Settlements, or BIS, in late June, and I'll leave a link to the full document in the description. Now, some of you might remember that we summarized this section of the BIS's annual economic report last year too. Back then, BIS Head of Research Hyun Song-shin was bombarded with questions about why these dystopian technologies are needed during a post-report press conference, press that the BIS had invited. You might recall that Hyun had revealed that these fast payment systems being rolled out around the world, such as FedNow in the US, are not all that different from CBDCs. This was just one of many bombshells dropped by Hyun during the question period. We suspect that he revealed a bit too much. That's because this year's press conference was very different. Hyun stuck to the script, which was that tokenization would make it possible to code regulatory compliance into every digital asset. He discussed the prospect of a global CBDC ledger where all assets will be tokenized, including stocks and real estate. In other words, every single asset in existence would be turned into a token that exists on a private, permissioned, and centralized blockchain controlled by central banks and governments around the world. As I mentioned in the introduction, you will literally own nothing in this kind of system. That's because the central banks and governments will ultimately have the power to determine which transactions you can or can't make, which things you can or can't sell, or turn off your ownership of certain assets. If you don't have physical proof of ownership, they could say you never owned them. Now, this begs the question of how close we are to such a system. As it so happens, this was the only question that Hyun was able to answer directly. His response? Quote, We are closer than we think because CBDCs are being rolled out around the world. All that's missing is a global settlement medium. If you're wondering how close CBDCs are to becoming a reality in your country, be sure to check out our recent CBDC update using the link in the description. Now, as for the report itself, it begins with a brief introduction, wherein its authors explain that an evolution in society has resulted in an evolution in money. They discuss the digitization of the financial system that occurred a few decades ago and claim that the next step in its evolution is tokenization. The report's authors define tokenization as, quote, the process of representing claims digitally on a programmable platform. They put programmable in italics because it's obviously important. Now, programmability means that transactions can be automatically controlled by centralized authorities. The authors acknowledge that crypto has pioneered the principle of programmability, but argue that it is a, quote, flawed system that couldn't possibly play the role of money. They say this is because money requires trust, and the only way to create this, quote, anchor of trust is via a central bank. For context, crypto is trustless, meaning that you don't have to trust anyone. This value proposition is becoming more apparent in an age where centralized institutions are becoming less trustworthy. After all, they consist of corruptible people. On the other hand, cryptos consist of immutable computer code. The authors then go on to reiterate that the only reason why money works as well as it does is because of the trust that central banks create, a truly delusional view. They even seem to imply that the only reason why money doesn't work well sometimes is because of the digital silos created by commercial entities. Naturally, the authors say there's only one solution to this financial fragmentation, and that's a, quote, unified ledger, which will harness, quote, the full benefits of tokenization while leveraging the supposedly unparalleled trust that individuals and institutions have in central banks. In other words, the only solution to the shortcomings of money is to put the entire financial system on a single, centralized blockchain that's controlled by the central banks. The rules programmed into the tokenized assets on this blockchain will presumably be decided by governments and lobbyists, of course. Now, the authors explain that having, quote, everything in one place also means that regulators will be able to keep track of every single transaction, complete surveillance. If that wasn't frustrating enough, the authors also discuss the possibility of having multiple unified ledgers that are application-specific. This is frustrating because the crypto industry basically consists of application-specific chains, and crypto projects in some ecosystems, such as Cosmos, explicitly design themselves to be application-specific. And that reminds me, Hyun was asked in the press conference if public blockchains could play a role. He said no. As a cherry on top, the report's authors call on the central banks to work closely with the private sector to implement this de facto digital prison in a way that's mutually beneficial. When you remember that the megabanks technically own the central banks already, you realize that this is already happening. Now, in the second part of the report, the authors dive deeper into the topic of tokenization. They start by explaining that tokens consist of information and rules, and confirm that, quote, tokens can be customized to meet specific user or regulatory requirements that apply to individual assets. They then discuss concepts that are cornerstones of crypto, like composability and smart contracts. On that note, if you're not sure how cryptos differ from CBDCs, check out our video about that using the link in the description. Spoiler, one is built for freedom, the other is built for control. Now, the authors then provide a perfect example of what I mean. When listing potential use cases for tokenization, they note, quote, built-in contingencies that depend on the actions of other depositors alter the incentives of depositors to be a first mover in a bank run setting. Plain English translation, they will make it impossible to pull your money out of the bank if there's a problem. Now, the authors then pivot to CBDCs and explain that tokenized asset ecosystems require a point of reference for price, such as fiat currencies. They note that stablecoins cannot play this role. The only solution is a CBDC. This means that CBDCs must exist on the same blockchain as tokenized assets. Interestingly, the authors seem to imply that wholesale CBDCs will be used for this. They also seem to imply that retail CBDCs will replace cash, since they say that they are, quote, digital representations of physical cash. For reference, most of these reports call retail CBDCs central bank liabilities, not cash. And for those unfamiliar, wholesale CBDCs are meant to be used by select individuals and institutions, whereas retail CBDCs are meant to be used by everyone else. In other words, there will be two CBDC systems, one for the elites and one for us. Odd that they would choose such a system for themselves. Anyways, if that wasn't crazy enough, the authors seem to imply that central banks should be given the power to convert every other form of digital money into a CBDC to, quote, support singleness. This is additional confirmation that central banks will control your assets in this kind of system. As expected, the authors note stablecoins as one form of alternative digital money. What's not expected, however, is that they include bank deposits as another alternative digital money. As you might have guessed, the authors insist that all bank deposits become tokenized to ensure singleness. Some folks at the BIS clearly aren't happy in their relationships. Anyway, lame jokes aside, the authors spend lots of time trying to justify why all bank deposits should be tokenized and controlled by central banks. They then return to the topic of stablecoins and provide a detailed timeline of stablecoin depeggings during Terra's collapse last year and the recent banking crisis. Besides the depeg risk, the authors take issue with the fact that most stablecoins are backed by government debt. They state that the government debt holdings of stablecoin issuers reduce, quote, the overall supply of liquid assets that are available for other purposes. Now, this is more significant than you might think because it underscores the angle that these central banks are coming from. Stablecoin issuers are hoarding liquid assets that should be used for other purposes. What's to stop them from saying the same about you making purchases they don't like? Anyway, to top it all off, the authors reiterate that tokenized bank deposits are the way to go because, unlike stablecoins, they would have strict KYC and AML at every step of the process. You would not be able to move a single cent without regulatory approval and oversight. And we're not even halfway through the report. The third part of the report pertains to interoperability, which is yet another cornerstone of the crypto industry. The authors start by saying that the potential of tokenization ultimately depends on how interoperable systems are. The BIS's solution to interoperability is to create one global unified ledger. Now, to be fair, the authors acknowledge that other ledgers, quote, could coexist with the global unified ledger. Even then, the authors envision a scenario where these ledgers, quote, merge and overlap until they become a part of the global unified ledger. It sounds like something out of a sci-fi novel, but it's not. Then, in an associated information box, the authors explain that, quote, on the road to a unified ledger, an intermediate solution would be to integrate legacy systems and existing infrastructures with new programmable platforms through application programming interfaces or APIs. Watch out for that. Now, if you're wondering what that looks like, the authors are kind enough to provide an infographic of what appears to be the 3 stages from today's financial system to the financial system of the future. All I see is an extremely centralized system that's inherently unstable and will inevitably result in collapse. The authors then explain the 2 aspects of a unified ledger. The first is that it, quote, combines all the components needed to complete a transaction on one platform. And the second is that it, quote, features money and assets as executable objects, meaning they can be exchanged entirely on-chain. They provide an even more detailed infographic of what a unified ledger would look like and make a bold claim. Some transactions will preserve privacy. This is a bold claim because the definition of privacy used by central banks typically means that they see everything, while the private sector sees nothing. In this case, however, the authors seem to be serious, and this could explain why they see the unified ledger as being oriented towards wholesale CBDC users. Newsflash: institutions and the elites want financial privacy more than anyone else. This is why we believe privacy is inevitable in crypto, assuming the governments and central banks don't destroy it, of course. In any case, the authors talk about another crypto cornerstone, and that's atomic swaps. In the context of a global unified ledger, this means swapping wholesale CBDCs for other assets. Note that if everything trades against the same CBDC, then investment diversification technically won't exist. The silver lining is that it seems that there will be multiple CBDCs because foreign exchange still exists in the future financial system the BIS envisions. The only difference is that all foreign currencies are digitized as CBDCs, and they all trade on the same global ledger. What could possibly go wrong? The authors then return to the topic of stopping bank runs and reveal that this would be done with smart contracts on a global unified ledger. They also claim that this same global unified ledger could be used for supply chain solutions and a whole slew of other use cases. So, not only will the global unified ledger do everything, but it'll store all the world's data too. The authors note that this data would be used to determine if you're allowed to get a loan, or if you're entitled to more universal basic income. Not actually, but it's the outcome of the ideas in the text, believe me. And, last but not least, this data could be used to ensure unparalleled compliance with KYC and AML at every turn. Now, to ensure these and other use cases, the data on the global unified ledger will be shared with the appropriate institutions, likely central banks, governments, regulators, and a few undocumented entities. And did I mention that the global unified ledger can be used in so-called green finance? You will be able to keep track of how much carbon is being reduced because of your investments. Say, maybe the carbon credits you're allocated will be tracked, including how you're spending this carbon allocation. You can learn more about the upcoming individual carbon credit scores using the link in the description. Anywho, the fourth part of the report is about the, quote, guiding principles of the global unified ledger. The authors start by saying that everything should be integrated with the global unified ledger so that the central banks can ensure singleness. Seriously, they say any application should integrate. Regarding scope, meanwhile, the authors reiterate that other ledgers may coexist with the global one, but should eventually become a part of the financial hive mind. They note that the global unified ledger must abide by the principles for financial market infrastructures laid out by the BIS in a different report. Now, this other report is almost 200 pages long, and unfortunately, we didn't have time to go through it in its entirety. Fortunately, though, the key takeaways are clear. It essentially consists of 24 principles which all types of financial market infrastructure should abide by. For once, nothing stuck out as concerning or dystopian. Makes a nice change. Now, regarding the governance of the global unified ledger, the authors effectively say that the central banks will be in control, but financial institutions in the private sector will have some input too, as will the governments and their regulators. Regarding financial inclusion, the authors don't say much. They just say that the entire financial system will eventually exist on this global unified ledger, which logically means that everyone will be a part of it, whether they like it or not. The best kind of inclusion, if you will. Regarding economic incentives, the authors admit that it's possible that not everyone will want to become a part of the global unified ledger. They cite over-the-counter or OTC trading as one example. In other words, some people will prefer to trade directly with each other outside of the system. Here is where things get scary. Quote, the experience from the introduction of fast payment systems suggests that mandating participation while simultaneously providing an infrastructure that allows for private sector innovation can be key to ensuring adoption. If you watched our recent video about FedNow, you'll know that Fed officials seem to imply that banks would eventually be obligated to use FedNow for all of their transactions. This quote from the BIS confirms that this is what the Fed officials are implying. We will force everyone into our CBDC system. Regarding privacy, the authors likewise admit that privacy concerns could be a hurdle to adoption, particularly to institutions, hence why privacy should be preserved. The authors claim that only commercial banks and users will see the sensitive information related to transactions. I doubt it. To be fair, the authors do provide a table of potential privacy solutions. The problem is that their explanation of these solutions is subpar, suggesting that they just Googled privacy solutions and copy and pasted the information into the report. It would honestly not surprise me in the slightest. For what it's worth, though, the authors discuss the possibility of allowing users to verifiably delete their data from the global unified ledger after some period of time, which is what some existing regulations allow. Again, I'm skeptical as to how available this option will really be, and if it will be for retail or only for institutions. Meanwhile, regarding cybersecurity, the authors admit that a cyber attack on or exploit of the global unified ledger would be absolutely devastating. They even admit that the larger and more centralized a system is, the more vulnerable it becomes to cyber attacks and exploits. That's why the authors pinky promise that the global unified ledger will have the highest level of cybersecurity so that it's impervious to the global cyber attack the World Economic Forum keeps warning about. No, that's not what they said, but yes, the WEF has been warning about a global cyber attack. More about that in the description. Anyhow, the authors conclude by tacitly admitting that the reason why the central banks want everything to happen on their global unified ledger is because they're terrified of new financial technologies that seek to replace them. FYI, this is what cryptocurrency is supposed to do. Speaking of which, the authors go out of their way to slam the shortcomings of the crypto industry and claim that only central banks can ensure the singleness of money. They say that the only thing standing in the way of their utopian vision is those pesky, quote, needs and constraints of sovereign countries. And finally, the authors state that, quote, this journey requires a shift in emphasis from individual experimentation to joint innovation. Public-private collaboration is essential to develop technological solutions, establish common platforms, and ensure proper oversight and supervision. Translation: please stop experimenting with financial technologies and work with us because we don't want to be replaced. So, it's fair to say that we want no part in the dystopian financial system the BIS and its constituents want to create. So, how can you protect yourself and your assets from the dystopian financial system that the BIS is shamelessly trying to roll out? Well, the honest answer is that you may not have to protect yourself at all because they may not succeed in creating a global unified ledger. Recent history has shown that trying to force the global population to comply with something doesn't work so well. That's because when you force something that you claim is good, it kind of becomes clear that it's not. Even so, this doesn't mean that the BIS won't try, and it's possible that they will succeed. That's because the precursors to this global unified ledger are already being voluntarily adopted around the world. I'm referring to the so-called fast payment systems that already exist in many countries, the first of which was introduced way back in 2009 by the UK. As I've mentioned in other videos about CBDCs, they will likely be benign and even beneficial when they're first introduced. Fast payment systems appear to be the benign and beneficial predecessors to CBDCs. Everyone is adopting them because they're convenient, without knowing what's coming next. As such, the first step to protecting yourself and your assets is to make sure you're not passively using these proto-CBDC systems. Now, this is much easier said than done, as it requires a lot of research and due diligence, but it's something that you should allocate time for if you're serious about avoiding CBDCs. The second step is to ask yourself which assets offer the best hedges against global unified ledgers and the like. Cryptocurrencies and precious metals are two possibilities, but even then, you need to be doing your research. That's because not all coins and tokens are created equal, nor are gold and silver bullion. The third step ties into the first two, and that's to keep informed about digital currency developments in your country or region. The number one thing to look out for is timelines. When will the fast payment system or CBDC be coming online? This will help with your hedging strategy regardless of your goal. Realistically, if the BIS does succeed in rolling out a global unified ledger or some similar system, it's going to be very hard to escape it. Unless you plan on living in the woods, you're going to have to partake to some extent. And even if you do plan on living in the woods, you're probably not going to do it alone. That's why the fourth and most critical step is to keep others informed. If enough of us are aware of what's coming and enough of us hedge ourselves properly, there could be enough assets outside of the system for a parallel system to function. Without this parallel system, resistance will be impossible. Now, some would say that this parallel system exists already with cryptocurrency, but crypto is still far from being ready for mass adoption. The good news is that crypto has and will continue to develop faster than CBDCs. The bad news is that some cryptos aren't far off from CBDCs, so this development helps the BIS. I reckon the constant references to crypto terms in today's report has made that clear enough. Whatever happens, it's important to remember that as a system becomes more centralized, it becomes more unstable. Central banks have been addressing this instability with more centralization, which only results in more instability. The financial system will probably collapse before a global unified ledger is released. Some would say that this would be an even worse outcome, and to that I say, worse outcome for who? It's clear the existing financial system isn't working for most people and that a new one is required. There's no way of knowing what this will look like, but it sure as hell won't be a global unified ledger. Well, that's all for today's video, folks. If you found it informative, let me know by smashing that like button. If you want to make sure you don't miss the next one, be sure to subscribe to the channel and ping that notification bell. Better yet, help keep others informed by sharing this video with the world. And if you plan on hedging against the BIS's financial system with crypto, make sure you're using reputable exchanges to accumulate it and the most secure hardware wallets to store it. We've got the biggest discounts on the latter and up to $40,000 of bonuses on the former at the Coin Bureau deals page. You can find your way there using the link in the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Adios, ciao, do pobacenia, goodbye.